Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Swedish Defence University for this first in a series of strategic talks on the war in Ukraine. It is now 12 days ago that Russia launched a completely unprovoked invasion of its neighboring state, Ukraine. This is not only an attack on the freedom, the security and the sovereignty of the Ukrainians. It was also an attack on the very value system on which the international community, the international order is built, and was therefore felt throughout the world. Let me immediately extend our heartfelt support for the Ukrainian people who are currently suffering in the cities around Ukraine, especially through a terrible humanitarian disaster. But also our admiration for their heroic defense of Ukraine. Because 12 days into this massive invasion campaign by the Russians, the Ukrainian defense forces, the political leadership, and not least the Ukrainian people are standing fast. We have seen tremendous surprises over these first 12 days. Positive ones in the Ukrainian defense capabilities, negative ones in what seems to be a rather incompetent, poorly planned and executed Russian early phase of the campaign, but also other positive aspects, not least the response of the international community to this campaign. So in this strategic talk series on Ukraine, we will try and cover all kinds of different aspects and angles on this conflict. We will use our own experts who are present today, but also invited guests throughout the series. We will try and provide new angles, in-depth discussions, but also those things that might not have time to be deliberated in the daily conversations in the media coverage. During this first session, we will partly discuss, first of all, why we have found ourselves in this situation that still feels rather unreal. A large-scale international war in the middle of Europe, with escalation possibilities that take us back or even supersede the very darkest days of the Cold War. We will also discuss how this campaign is fought. What early surprises and lessons can we find and draw? Finally, we will talk about the response of the international community and what the future might hold in store for us. It is still very early, but we are doing our best to make sense of this, and that is the very purpose of this series. And you are again most welcome. To take us through this, my name is Robert Egnell. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the Swedish Defence University. I'll have a seat now, and I'll introduce our tremendous panel of experts. First of all, Heather Harrison Dinniss, who is a senior lecturer at the Center for International Operational Law here at the Swedish Defence University. Your research areas really gets the juices flowing. It focuses on the impact of modern warfare in international humanitarian law, and you focus on military technologies such as cyber warfare, advanced and autonomous systems, and the legal aspects of human enhancement techniques and international law. You are the author of Cyber War and the Laws of War with Cambridge University Press, amongst many other things. Dr. Niklas Nilsson, welcome. You are an associate professor in war studies, and here we see that we are struggling to decide whether we have the American nomenclature or the British one. Associate professor in war studies and the land operations divisions. Your areas of interest include tactics and operations, hybrid warfare, asymmetric threats, but also, and very relevant for today's research seminar, a specific interest in the post-Soviet space, focusing on the Caucasus and the Black Sea region, conflict and security in that region. And finally, Kjell Engelbrekt, a professor of political science at the Defence University, with a broad range of research areas as well, from international security and strategic affairs to diplomacy. But I believe from the very beginning you are what we back then referred to as a Sovietologist, focusing on Russia and the security thereof. Amongst your publication is the book High Table Diplomacy, published by Georgetown University Press a few years ago. Very relevant for today, obviously. You are all very welcome. Now, let's get into the first very tricky question of why we find ourselves in this situation. Because Vladimir Putin has launched this vast attack on Ukraine with tremendous costs, obviously. Even just the build-up phase had tremendous costs to it. Despite serious challenges in the early stages of this campaign, there seems to be no signs of stopping. So what is the Russian rationale for this war? Why are we finding so? And I'm saying then Russia's rationale because there is no one else to blame for this. But what is Russia and Vladimir Putin thinking? What are they hoping to get out of this?
Well, thank you for the question. We should perhaps begin by just pointing out that Vladimir Putin wields more power as a Russian political leader than any predecessor, except perhaps for Joseph Stalin. So he has, during 22 years, amassed a lot of power in his personality, we could say. He is wielding despotic power to an extent that Soviet leaders rarely did. They were in the Politburo at the time. We should also perhaps point out his background as an intelligence officer, which means that he's always thinking in terms of how to distract others from realizing what he's up to, especially if he has malign intentions in any particular way. So there's always an element of subterfuge in much of his actions. But that being said, I think political scientists have a bit of a problem when it comes to trying to read the tea leaves when it comes to just one person. You need to be close to that person. I'm not a Putin biographer, and I don't even have as my main assignment at the Swedish Defence University to follow Russian political affairs. But I do it as a kind of a side assignment because of interest and because I've been following it for more than 25 years. I think we can ascribe three motives to Mr. Putin narrowly and to the Kremlin more broadly. And the first is the one that all these diplomats were trying to pursue during the weeks up to the invasion, when we had troops on the border of Ukraine. That's the military strategic motive. I think there is such a motive, but the red lines expressed and articulated by Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister, were non-starters to begin with. They were very far-reaching. Basically, they wanted to have as few NATO member states on Russia's border as possible, and to the extent that there were any, they could not have any offensive systems basically deployed on their territory. And that's certainly a non-starter for NATO in general. It's difficult to understand the rationale in many ways for people in Europe because Russia wields a very big war machine and also nuclear weapons. So why these concerns? Well, this resonates with the Russian people because of what has happened previously in the previous century, and especially the Second World War, where tens of millions of Russians perished. So it resonates in family histories with people. So that's something to keep in the background. Now, the second motive, I think I call the nationalistic historic motive. And that was the one that people who follow Russian affairs are very much aware of. But we many of us were introduced to on the 21st of February with the long speech, the 55-minute speech, when he talked about Ukraine not really being a state, not really being a fully sovereign state, not having enough stateness to it. And this goes to Russian history, where Russia is portraying itself as the trunk of the branch of the Slavic peoples, and that trunk should be standing in Moscow. But historically, everybody is aware, also Putin, that historically this trunk stands in Kiev. That's where the first churches were, that's where the religious and cultural history sprang out of. So there's a rivalry here of two Romes, if you like. Moscow wants to be the third Rome, but there's the historical. So that creates an incentive for Putin to get that portion of the Slavic Russian tree into his fold. Now, these are two stated assumptions and stated motives, and then there's one unstated or unspoken, and that is the political motive. If Ukraine was to become a democratic, free, open society with a flourishing economy, it would become an alternative to what Putin is building up in Russia. It would become a window, a very attractive window for many Russian speakers. People understand very well Russian. Most Ukrainians still speak Russian, although they do it less after 2014. Many have switched to Ukrainian by force of will, basically, to demonstrate that they are distinct from the Russians in Russia proper. So I think that motive is perhaps the most decisive one when it comes to the incentives and the motives of Mr. Putin.
Thank you very much. I've heard a lot of people say that Vladimir Putin really doesn't care about appearances or whether he looks bad. But what he does care about are consequences. And part of why we're here is the failure to present serious consequences for past behavior. But Heather, you've noted that whether he cares about appearances or not, he's actually trying very hard to present this in terms of international legal frameworks. Can you walk us through that argument? And does he have a point at all, or is that all nonsense? I mean, what are the real international legal aspects of this?
Right, well, you're exactly right. He's using the language of international law in an attempt to try and legitimize what he's doing. So in this big, long speech that got appended to the Article 51 submission before the UN, anytime you use force in self-defense, you have to notify the UN Security Council. This time, they just stapled his speech to their notification and put that in. So in this speech, we can see him using the language of international law, throwing up reasons why Russia is invading. So he talks about the language of self-defense, that Russia didn't want to do this, but they had to do it in individual self-defense of Russia because of the threat from the states on the borders that were turning to NATO, that this somehow was a threat to Russia. I should state at the outset that none of the arguments that he's making you can make out in international law. So he uses this idea of individual self-defense, but the threat, you'd be talking anticipatory self-defense. Russia hasn't suffered an armed attack, which is what you need for individual self-defense. So you'd be talking anticipatory self-defense, and the threat is so far removed that you can't say that it has any notion of imminence attached to it, which is what we need in international law for anticipatory self-defense, which on its own is a fairly controversial notion in international law. And then the second reason he puts forward is, oh, well, it's collective self-defense of these two provinces that I've just recognized as states. So I've recognized these breakaway regions as states, they're now states, and they're calling for Russia in collective self-defense. Again, you can't, under international law, just make a territory a state. There are rules around what is a state, and just to bring in, Kjell, your point about saying, well, Ukraine isn't really a sovereign state, you also can't take away someone's statehood by saying it's not really a state. So he has this individual self-defense of Russia and then collective self-defense of these two provinces, neither of which stand up under international law. And then the third justification he sort of throws at the wall is this genocide that's allegedly going on, which is not made out on the facts. Ukraine is currently before the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, arguing exactly that there is no genocide going on, and they are misusing the Genocide Convention as a reason to invade. Even if there was a genocide going on, that does not give another state a right to invade another country. There is in international law a concept of humanitarian intervention. It is highly controversial. There are only 3 states in the world that ascribe to that view. That's the UK, Denmark, and Belgium. Russia is not one of them. Neither is the rest of the international community. So he's trying out all of these different rationales in an attempt to make it sound like what he's doing is legal. But it's not. None of them can be made out legitimately under international law. And neither can Ukraine's statehood be taken away from it under international law.
It's really interesting, and it sort of makes sense then why he's suddenly talking about Ukraine being weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon as well, as another point of sort of self-defense arguments.
Of course, and he's harking back to Western interventions that have happened that have been legally questionable as well. So he's harking back to other interventions. So the Iraq War he's mentioned a number of times, and so now we see this bringing up of, Ukraine's weeks away from having nuclear weapons. It's sort of using that same analogy, you did it, so it must be okay for us to do it. But it kind of brings us around to that point that we all learnt in kindergarten, and it's the same there as it is in international law. 2 wrongs don't make a right. You can't, just because somebody else did something that might be legally questionable, you can't use that as justification for your own.
I'll move into the conduct of warfare on the ground now, and Niklas, you've studied Russian warfare for a long time, and focusing on this particular region as well. I've been struck by all of these surprises that I mentioned early on, and there are more when we dig into the tactical level of things. What are your initial thoughts on the conduct of Russian operations during these first 12 days? What are your main surprises and sort of lessons and takeaways at this stage, even though it's very early days, I know?
Well, I think to begin with, in the initiation of this attack on Ukraine, I thought the most baffling thing was we've heard this propaganda narrative coming from Moscow now for several years about questioning Ukraine as even as a country, Ukraine as a weak society that doesn't really have its own identity, Ukraine's political leadership being dominated by fascist elements and lacking public support, and of a weak and divided West. And these are propaganda narratives, but the amazing or the baffling thing about the initiation of this operation is that the Russian forces acted as if these narratives were actually true. We've seen an attempt at a lightning attack on Kiev, supposedly with the anticipation that Russian forces would be able to quickly depose the Ukrainian leadership, take over key government buildings in Kiev, and that would be that. That would be the end of Ukrainian resistance. We also saw basically no serious attempt at establishing air superiority, for example, which would otherwise, this would logically be the first and most significant thing in the first few days of a war like this. There are different theories as to why this didn't happen, but the Russian Air Force basically has not been a part of this fight so far. We've also seen extremely high risk and dangerous operations trying to land VDV forces, airborne forces, without air superiority, with quite devastating consequences. And this these actions in the beginning have obviously been very costly for Russia. We've also seen immense problems with logistics, problems bringing fuel, ammunition to the front, which actually seems to have slowed the Russian advance. The backdrop of this, or the gloomy side of this, is that we are now seeing Russian forces reorganize over the last couple of days to fight more in line with the way that they train and exercise, which basically means using massive amounts of artillery to prepare the ground for maneuver elements of their forces. We are seeing this being brought about in the attempts at surrounding and besieging Ukrainian cities. And I also expect that the level of destruction that we will see in the coming weeks will be something far more devastating than we have seen so far. But based on these initial impressions of the way that the Russians have fought, these seems to be based on totally erroneous assumptions about the capabilities of the Russian forces, and also, perhaps even more importantly, a vast underestimation of the amount of resistance that the Ukrainian army would be able to put up against them.
You're an expert in hybrid warfare, and my assumption going into this, if it would have happened, I would have expected a sort of a Russian version of shock and awe in terms of hybrid warfare, combining the maneuver operations and the air support with information campaigns, cyber attacks, Ukraine going black immediately, having no internet, shutting seminars like this down all over the world, providing a counter-argument, etc. But we haven't seen that either. Is it the same reasons, or are they just not as capable as we thought?
Well, we have seen it to some extent. We have seen attempts to shut down Ukrainian government sites, media information channels, and so on, just not very efficient and successful. We also saw during this enormous military buildup over several months, there were actually parallel attempts to foment public unrest inside Ukraine, to channel particularly people's frustration with rising energy prices, which Russia has also been manipulating, especially the prices of coal, and to channel that into dissatisfaction with the political leadership, plus other attempts, activities by intelligence services on the ground, and other things to build up an internal pressure in the Ukrainian leadership that it seemed was supposed to be working in sync with the external pressure being built up by the military build-up outside Ukraine's borders. But this has not been very efficient, and it seemingly has had very limited effects. Why is that? I think we need to remember that Ukraine today is quite a different country in terms of resilience and defensive capabilities than it was in 2014. Ukraine has been living with a Russian invasion now for 8 years, preparing for something like this. It's a very different thing to employ these hybrid methods, so to say, in a country, in the kind of country that Ukraine is today than it was 8 years ago.
But as you said, they are changing, and we've seen the Russians adapt and overcome before, with Chechnya as a horrific example of that, obviously. Russian troops are now increasingly encircling or moving into the cities. They are employing artillery to an extent that we haven't seen in the early days. What can we expect as the fighting moves into the cities now?
Another factor in this is, I think, Russian frustration on the Russian side with the lack of progress that we have seen so far, and also how this reflects on the Russian military. I mean, this is supposed to be the hyper-modernized Russian military that has been a pet project of the Putin regime, and now we are seeing these immense problems. This is actually this is the first time that Russia is trying to conduct an actual operation of this size and magnitude. And now we are seeing what happens when there is somebody firing back at you. But we have to. I mean, the fact of fighting in defended cities it's quite beneficial for those defending the city. It's easy to fight in cities. You can't leverage advantages that you have with long-distance precision fires, technology, or maneuver elements in the way that you can in the open. So if the Russians actually try to advance on, say, Kiev, for example, we can expect fighting street to street, house to house, immense levels of destruction, and very serious losses on both sides, but particularly those attacking. This is the reality of heavy fighting in cities, which is also why the Russian strategy so far seems to have been to encircle rather than move into cities with serious forces. They have been trying to move light special forces units into cities, at least in the initial stages of this, and to basically take control of what can move in and out of the city, cut off supplies, cut off electricity, and also we've also seen several examples of what seems to be downright terror bombing of civilian neighborhoods. We're seeing rocket artillery directed directly at civilian buildings. So I think, besides maybe from Kiev, which is, as we talked about before, such an important symbol of Russian civilization, I think, unfortunately, that we will see medieval type sieges of other Ukrainian cities that I think risk looking like Grozny or Aleppo in a few weeks.
Yeah. So clearly, the Russians aren't backing down. They're in this for the long haul. Kjell, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I think a very important point that Niklas pointed out is the 8th year of preparations for something akin to this, although this was perhaps on a bigger scale. But the mental preparedness that the Ukrainians have, that's clearly Ukrainians at large. It's not just the defense apparatus and the police. I started subscribing to Ukrainian TV 2 months ago, and I've been watching instead of Netflix to the horror of my wife. But it's been fascinating to see how sophisticated the Ukrainian media are. I mean, they were all up until the invasion. But up until the invasion, they had all the kind of formats you have in Western TV studios. And the day after the invasion, they had the same kind of operation, but in the basement, and with the flag behind. And the broadcast ended with "Slava Ukraina." So they had basically just switched to the information war that we've been seeing unfolding. And it seems to me that the military gains that the Russians are now doing they're gaining ground, but the information war may already have been won by the Ukrainians. They have won the world, they have won the world opinion, and so that is certainly an asset that will continue to be an asset. A quick point only on cyber and hybrid that you were talking about. There is, I think, a component of the Americans providing a helping hand when it comes to cyber and intelligence. I think the Americans, or we know, they've come up a couple of things in the American press over the past week or so that suggest that high-grade intelligence is being fed into the presidential administration for sure, and perhaps even to some military commanders, and also that there's an operation going on cyber where they're mitigating, I think, or even thwarting some of the actions on the Russian side. So I think that's probably part of what's going on, and we'll learn more about that in the months and years ahead.
And we'll come back to the international response. But Heather, I wanted to ask you, we're hearing then we might expect medieval-type sieges, increasing shelling of civilian neighborhoods, and this door-to-door, house-to-house, street-to-street kind of fighting. That takes us into really tricky legal territory, obviously. Can you comment a bit on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, I guess the first point to understand is that war has rules. And while it may seem that it doesn't at times, there is a whole body of law that has been built up over time that regulates the conduct of hostilities. So we talk about medieval sieges. You know, the sieges have been around for a long time. There are actually rules about sieges and what you can and you cannot do. Both Russia and Ukraine are parties to Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, and their starvation as a method of warfare is absolutely prohibited. Starvation of civilian population is absolutely prohibited. So that, in some ways, almost outlaws a full-on medieval siege. There are other rules in the Fourth Geneva Convention that sort of allow for access to humanitarian personnel, that allow for the vulnerable, the aged, maternity cases, children to be evacuated from siege. So there are rules around it. Whether or not they are followed is another question. And there, I know we'll come on to measures of enforcement in a little bit, but there is the question. But there are rules around these things. In terms of what we're seeing on the ground at the moment, this move to urban warfare, there are specific rules. There are also general principles that apply in any armed conflict, the most basic of which is the principle of distinction, the requirement that you distinguish between military objectives and combatants on the one hand, and civilians and civilian objects on the other. And you only target your attacks against military objectives. There's also a principle of proportionality, which says that you cannot cause excessive harm to civilians and civilian objects against the military advantage than you anticipate, even if what you are aiming at is a military objective. So we've got rules that say, okay, you may not target civilians. And even if you're targeting a military objective, if you're going to cause excessive harm to civilians and civilian objects, that is also an unlawful attack. So there are these principles that underlie all of the laws, and that's just to name two of them. So when we see resort to high explosive weapons like thermobaric weapons in populated areas, then you're moving into a weapon that is being used in a space that it was not designed for. So you're using it in a way that is disproportionate, so you're going to cause excessive harm to civilians and civilian objects. It's also indiscriminate, because you're not discriminating between what that bomb is going to target. So weapons like that are going to be prohibited as we move into the cities. Other methods like shelling humanitarian corridors, obviously, is going to be completely prohibited under the law. So there are rules that apply, and there are rules that are being breached. We're seeing cluster munitions being used. There is a convention against cluster munitions that prohibits cluster munitions. Neither Ukraine nor Russia are party to that. So the prohibition doesn't, under the treaty, doesn't apply. However, we're seeing them dropped on kindergartens. So again, we come back to this idea of you're using a weapon in a space it was not designed for, in a way that is indiscriminate and disproportionate. So even when we can look to particular forms of weapons, there are principles at stake here that are clear, that are well known, and that both Russia and Ukraine have signed up for.
I'll move on to the international system. I guess that's one of the great surprises as well, not least for Vladimir Putin, but perhaps for us cynical security scholars as well, who have described the international order as increasingly polarized and weak in tackling international issues. But suddenly we're seeing something else. Kjell, would you care to elaborate a bit to lead us off in that discussion?
Sure. I'm still a bit cynical, though. I think it's too little too late in many respects. If you look at the UN Security Council, I mean, you get exactly what you expect. Russia is one of the P5 countries. It has veto power, so it vetoes any process toward a resolution that would be binding. Instead, you got the Uniting for Peace process in the General Assembly, where 141 countries strongly condemned Russia's actions. 5 countries supported, or 4 besides Russia itself, supported Russia's actions. The usual suspects, I don't need to enumerate them here, I think. And then 35 countries that went AWOL, that were no-shows or abstended, if you like, formally. So that's also to be expected, I think. But it was a fairly strong showing, at least on the part of the sending a signal, demonstrating that we're still standing up for international legal principles. I'm something of a fan of the OSCE, not because it accomplishes that much, perhaps. It's a talking club, but it's been in Ukraine since March 21st, 2014. And it's been monitoring, and it's been documenting. And if we get to The Hague one day, a lot of that documentation will be very pertinent, I would predict. So the OSCE is, I think, an important player in this for the historical record, at least, and perhaps for the legal record. Well, NATO stands up and has been reinvigorated because, not exclusively because of altruism, I guess, also because a number of these countries in Central East Europe feel threatened, basically. So they stand up for Article 5. And we've also triggered a discussion in this country and in neighboring Finland. We don't have time to get into this here. But it's to my mind, a completely logical discussion to have in this context. And then you have had the European Union being able to come together in a fairly unprecedented way and spending a lot of money. And this may mean that the European countries nationally, but also collectively, will spend more money on defense and get to the 2% roughly each country, but also do things collaboratively so that we don't distribute all this money in all these different countries, that we also put the investments into joint projects and thereby save a lot of money. So I think that's something to be welcomed and to be looking forward. I think if I'm impressed with something, it's a lot of corporations, a lot of sports associations, a lot of civil society organizations that have responded, I think, above what I would have expected. So that's something, I think, that may also resonate with ordinary Russians at some point, to the extent that this information isn't completely filtered out before it reaches Russia. But so I still think it's a bit underwhelming in terms of the response, but especially I think it's a little too little and too late.
Heather, every time international law is under attack or it's broken, the death of it is proclaimed. But you've highlighted in a number of ways how it is relevant. Will it survive this one as well, or is it time to just say it's all politics and none of the law?
It will survive this, as it has survived many other attacks against international law, as you point out. And I'll say to you guys something that I say to my A-level course students. Look, think about all the times that domestic law is violated, and we don't question whether or not there should be a law against murder because someone unfortunately got murdered. It's the same thing with international law. The difference with international law is you're dealing with a system where you have sovereign and equal states. So the people who make the law are also the people who enforce the law, who are also governed by the law. So you've got a horizontal system instead of a vertical system that you would have in a domestic legal system. Now that brings with it certain outcomes in that we don't have a police force that we can send in to fix things. We don't have a court that has compulsory jurisdiction over states. States have to agree to go before that court. So we're currently seeing the mechanisms of international law and the enforcement of international law at play, working. Those sanctions that you're seeing being put in place are a result of international law. The fact that Ukraine is before the International Court of Justice, holding Russia accountable for misusing the Genocide Convention, for which Russia is also a party, is a function of international law. So we're seeing countermeasures being put in place by states, we're seeing sanctions being put in place. Obviously, referral to the Security Council is not going to work when the person who's being referred is a P5 member, but nobody expected that it would. But when you have 141 states standing up in the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace resolution saying, this was unlawful, this was an act of aggression, then that counts towards strengthening international law because you've got states standing up and saying this was a violation. So you have in some ways a strengthening of customary international law, which is a combination of state practice and opinio juris, and you've got states bringing that to bear saying this is aggression, this is unlawful. So that's not nothing. And the mere fact that Putin is twisting his words to try and make what he's doing fit with international law shows you that he does actually care about that. So we've got all of these factors at play. We've also seen the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, the ICC, start an investigation into what's going on in Ukraine. So what I would caution you is you will never see Putin brought before the ICC, charged with aggression, because Russia is not party to the ICC statute, but Ukraine is, and has brought this to the attention. Also, 39 states referred the situation to the ICC. So the investigator has brought forward his investigation or started his investigation. So you can see international law and all the enforcement mechanisms that we have in international law at play doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's just that they don't look like a police force coming in and arresting someone.
All right. I must ask you, though, because we're hearing now, Vladimir Putin and the Russian armed forces, they're struggling on the ground. They're in for the long haul, and it's going to be incredibly costly. The international community is invigorated. You described NATO at least. We're seeing countries like Germany completely change their defense policies overnight, becoming the fourth biggest spender in the world on the armed forces, etc. The NATO debate is invigorated as well within Finland and Sweden. There seem to be very few options for Vladimir Putin. He is somewhat cornered. Is this true? Does he feel cornered, you think, Kjell?
So this is why I want to quarrel a little here to make it more interesting, but also to connect to why I think the response is too little, too late, because this is a repeat offender. I mean, this has been going on for quite some time. To me, Vladimir Putin has kind of perfected a special blend of brutality, subterfuge, and perseverance. And he's been getting away with this. So the Chechnya bombings in the late 1990s, he was first head of the FSB and then he became president. That was the brutality. He learned that brutality works. Brutality really gets the job done. And there was no punishment really for that. Subterfuge, Georgia. I mean, you've done some work on Georgia. How they distracted both the Georgians and the international community in that respect, and was able to get away with that. And then Syria, I would say, in 2011. That's where he showed the perseverance. That was a several-year-long campaign where he helped Assad to regain much of the lost territory. And then he used all of the components of this blend, I think, in the annexation of Ukraine. The subterfuge, you remember the green little men, and the brutality of the separatist onslaught, and so on and so forth. So in that respect, I think it's too little too late. And I wonder, there's still, I think, a chance that he gets away with this one. Although it's a much bigger project, so the stakes are higher for everybody.
Niklas, what would a victory look like? How can he go back to Moscow with a victory in Ukraine?
This is an interesting question, and remember also that victory or winning in a war, these are very fluid and elusive concepts. I think, this is not about something that would objectively look like a victory anymore for the Russian government. It's about making some kind of gain that he can bring back and present as a plausible victory to Russian elites and the Russian people. And what might that be? Would that be a corridor connecting the so-called People's Republics with Crimea and perhaps Transnistria? I don't know. I mean, that would be a pretty weak gain from the likely tens of thousands of Russian soldiers that are eventually going to die in Ukraine. But there needs to be some kind of tangible gain. But then, I mean, is that a victory? No, not really, because I mean, if the objective was to reincorporate Ukraine with Russia, I mean, Ukraine and Ukrainian people, they are lost to Russia forever as an effect of this war.
Kjell, would you like to comment on that as well? And I also wanted to prepare, if we have some microphones, we can throw in questions from the audience as well. So raise your hands and we'll run around with microphones while Kjell comments as well.
Yeah. I think if you accept my contention that we can ascribe three motives, and this military strategic one, the historic nationalist one, and then the more self-serving political unspoken one. If the latter was the most important one, to undermine the possibilities for Ukraine to become a flourishing democracy and market economy and economy, then he may accomplish this, at least for the next 10 years. Ukraine will have real problems emerging from this rubble. So in that respect, that may be gained. The European security order, well, I think it's still, we're still hanging under some kind of cloud here. Obviously, we're not supposed to be able to walk through that door of NATO's together with Finland. That's obviously the idea. And Russia may insist on that. We don't know. So I think the jury is out. As I shouldn't be saying that with a law professor sitting next to me, perhaps. It's a kind of a banal thing to say, but I think it's too early to say.
Let's grab a couple of questions from the audience.
Yes, I'll start off. My name is Olle. I'm a student in political science, and I'd like to pose a question concerning the presence of foreign elements combating for Russia. So we've seen examples of soldiers that have been fighting in Syria, for example, now being deployed in Ukraine, also troops under Chechen command. How do you explain what they have as a motive, and how do they align with Russia, and to what extent does it not align with Russia?
This one is for me.
Go ahead, Niklas. Yeah. And let's move the mic to the next one.
Yeah, this is a good question, and these are also quite different elements that we're talking about. I mean, the Chechen fighters under basically coming from Ramzan Kadyrov's private army in Chechnya, they have been deployed to numerous other conflicts like this. They were deployed in Georgia, they were deployed in Syria, and their function, I believe, as they are deployed outside of Kiev right now, is to it's to conduct ruthless urban warfare. These are trained, experienced troops in that department. Syrian fighters, these are, I mean, basically for the same reasons. These are also fighters who are experienced from fighting in Syria, Aleppo, and so on. There is also elements of the Wagner group present in Ukraine. And then the overall, besides that these are forces that can be utilized for these purposes, they are also not, I mean, if they die in battle, that's not most people in Russia is not going to care about that to the extent that having Russian conscripts coming home in caskets will stir public anger. Having Syrians or Chechens or mercenaries from the Wagner group killed, that's not going to matter so much for the Russian public.
I might add then, the question has been posed, yeah, go ahead up there, to what extent Russia can take all of Ukraine. And I think, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, winning the battle is probably possible, given the size of the Russian army, even though it'll be incredibly difficult from what we've witnessed in the early phase of this campaign. But holding that territory, and this is a vast territory with 44 million Ukrainians, conservative counterinsurgency theory tells us that that's going to take at least 900,000 men over time, which would then cripple Russia's economy as well as their armed forces for the foreseeable future. That is probably not going to be possible. Can they install a puppet regime? Well, after what the Ukrainians have suffered, will they accept anyone appointed from Moscow at this stage? Probably not, right? So that option seems almost off the table unless, again, Putin is completely delusional. And we hope that that's not the case, because that might then turn this incredibly violent. But I also wanted to ask you before I let you in, is there a risk here of an escalation if he is cornered? How might he then sort of change the narrative or change the current sort of negotiating position that is currently not very good? Might he actually look for a geographic escalation here? Try to bring NATO in or something like that? Kjell, what are your thoughts?
I don't think it's likely, but I don't think he can back down. I certainly think there probably will be an escalation in the next 1 to 2 weeks. Yeah. I think he wants to try and break. And I think the morale is the thing, actually. I think that's, but that's probably just me being a political scientist from the sidelines. But it seems to me that the Ukrainians have a lot of powerful morale and ready to do self-sacrifice, and the Russians have very little of it. I mean, a lot of these conscripts thought they were going to an exercise, and they realized suddenly they could read the signs in Cyrillic, and they realized that they were in this kind of brother country. So to many of them, including to a very famous Russian general who discussed this a month ago, this is fratricide to a lot of people. This is the killing of brothers. So it's not strange that you don't have a powerful sense of purpose among parts of the conscripts, but probably even among the officers.
Niklas?
I agree with that. I mean, what we're seeing now, the way that the fighting has evolved, this is the result of Ukraine investing very heavily in army defensive forces, defensive equipment, and defensive tactics. We're seeing how they are able to operate in small units with anti-tank and anti-air weapons. I mean, and this is also, as Kjell's point, I mean, what ultimately decides these outcomes is the will and cohesion of the forces that are fighting each other, and we are seeing an immense will to fight on the Ukrainian side, and in many places it seems that Russian soldiers are basically deserting. But remember, this is only the first line of defense. Ukraine also has a quite large territorial forces, which would correspond to Hemvärn in Sweden, which would be able to conduct, I mean, warfare that is, I mean, not as organized as conventional forces, but would still be extremely dangerous to Russian forces when, I mean, trying to hold territory and occupy cities. And then there is also apparently a very strong will to resist in the public in general. So I agree with your point. I mean, this is if the idea has been to take and occupy and control the entire Ukraine, this must be based on really bad intelligence on the Russian side. I mean, if this actually was the operational plan.
Please.
Thank you. Niklas, I believe you hinted that the propaganda narrative that the Kremlin is using to legitimize their actions hasn't turned out of the blue. I was specifically wondering what they're deriving painting the Ukrainian regime as fascist from.
Do you mean what they're gaining from that?
No, where does this derive from? How long has this specific element of the narrative been going for? And how are they upholding that?
Well, I mean, this particular narrative is something that emerged with the I think with the Euromaidan protests in 2013, where you had, I mean, yes, there are right-wing and fascist groups in Ukraine, and some of them had some presence during the 2013 Maidan. I mean, and then so they exist, yes. Then this has been blown out of, I mean, into, I mean, massively exaggerated proportions on the Russian side. If you listen to the narratives coming from Moscow, you will think that this is, I mean, this is the dominating political part of the Ukrainian government. And why is that being used like this? I mean, this has to do with the creation of a threat or a perception of a threat towards Russian minorities, not only in Ukraine but also in other places, and how they are being threatened. I mean, and we hear the word genocide being thrown around. This is also not the first time in Ukraine. You also had, I mean, they would make the same argument about South Ossetia in Georgia, for example, that the Georgians were committing a genocide against South Ossetians. And then, of course, the word fascist really resonates with in Russia with the Russian public, considering history and the Great Patriotic War and so on. So this is, I mean, this is a piece of information that has really been, I mean, it's been one of the main foci of Russian propaganda versus Ukraine.
It's also part of this legitimizing or trying to legitimize it under international law as well, to say, okay, this is what's going on, this is why we're going in, we're really the good guys here. So for the past 10 years or so, Putin and the Russian Federation have been trying to position themselves as the guardians of international law. And so it's part of trying to fold into that narrative of saying, no, we're going in here as the protectors, we're going in here to save either, you know, our nationals or our ethnic brothers and sisters from this dreadful thing that's happening to them. So that's part of it as well, and pushing that narrative to say we're on the right side of this.
Final question. We're running out of time.
All right, there's so much to unpack here, so many interesting things, and thank you so much for a very interesting seminar. I've got a question about escalation. Considering the fact that Putin might be very cool and not coming home with a brilliant victory of his, is there a potent risk of escalating, jumping over a number of steps and actually going so far as to use nuclear weapons? So going from what we're seeing now to being a cornered president using that kind of weaponry in the future. What are your reflections on that?
The nuclear question.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, it's obvious that it was mentioned in one of the speeches. It was not a very veiled threat that was expressed. There was also this attack on adjacent to a nuclear power plant, which may be another way of rattling the same kinds of nerves. But going beyond that, I still think NATO has a very powerful position, I think, in terms of deterring that kind of behavior. So it certainly would take us into this kind of delusional thinking or magical thinking, perhaps. There's some almost magical thinking in believing that the people would greet the Russians as liberators, but this would go beyond that. And there are also certain restrictions and inhibitions within the Russian decision-making system, making that unlikely, that you still have to involve military officers in that kind of decision-making. So it is a risk, it's a danger, but I don't think it's very likely.
Quick final word.
An add-on to that is that no, it's not very likely, but it's important for Putin to project the image that he is a person who might actually be capable of doing something like this. Using strategic nuclear weapons, I don't think so either. Using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, I don't think that is likely. It's not something that I would rule out completely. But remember also that there is much more conventional destructive capability in the Russian armed forces that haven't really come to use yet. So I would not see that as that would be an action of desperation. But I don't think it's something that we will be likely to see in the near future.
Thank you so much. I could go on the entire afternoon, but this was a 1-hour seminar. The first of strategic talks on Ukraine. So the conversation will continue, probably next week already. Keep an eye open for the next session, the next number of experts with new perspectives and in-depth analysis. But first of all, please join me in thanking our great experts, Heather, Kjell, and Niklas, who provided some excellent perspective for us today. Thank you so much, and welcome back.